summit is over. Were no fist fight, no insults, which is good. And actually, atmosphere was pretty, polite. But the bit that press conference was kind of strange. Usually, two people stand next to each other, then but this didn't happen. Although Putin admitted, actually his team admitted, plenty of American reporters who asked very tough questions, but on Biden's side, there were no Russian media. Actually, probably no foreign media at all. I don't know. This is kind of strange, but the most important thing of this is that in general, spirit is what's important is spirit, and I think spirit was pretty good, taking into account what we have right now. The good things, of course, that they finally agreed to have some serious discussion and form some groups. Of course, cyber group, nuclear arms, maybe some other, I don't know, I didn't know about the climate group, but maybe some of you will add to this discussion. What about things is that the most important, I think, at least from my point, discussed or on the same page. And we know that in Ukraine, this is the hottest spot. And a few weeks ago, we almost started a war, which could grow into World War III. I wish they could spend more time on Ukraine. The only good thing is that Biden agreed that Minsk Accords is the way to go. But we knew this for 7 years. And I wish that Biden would play maybe a larger role and force Ukraine into accepting Minsk. Because before Poroshenko and Zelensky, they openly say that in the present form, Minsk Accord is not something that they would like to follow. So unless the United States, because it looks like Europe can do too much, unless Biden forces and Zelensky comes to see him in July, explains to him that he has to follow this accord, then this problem will stay and can grow into something that no one wants. So this was my short introduction. I wish that, I'm pretty sure that some of you will have different opinion. So let's see who wants to start. We have free for all.
I have a question.
Sure.
Let's just get started.
Okay.
Who knows what strategic stability means? How is it different from just everyday relations?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Well, I think strategic stability is to avoid War III. This is
well, that's good. The bar pretty low. It's survival.
Yeah, right. Okay, so maybe Nick, since it started, then let's
have to answer my own question.
Okay. Well, let's agree that you have each of us 7-10 minutes, and so let's go.
Well, I think we are starting from a very low point, but I think I like the rhetoric. I like the optics of it, and I think I understand why Biden was not allowed to stand next to Putin, because he looks old and can lose his way. And imagine, if the Russian or any foreign journalist got a chance to ask him a follow-up question, it just wouldn't necessarily go according to plan. So I think, the message, as I get it, watching the U.S. news a day later, is that Biden, the message is, the spin is, Biden accomplished what he wanted. Which again, he could have done with a phone call, but this at least sets a chemistry. The word that's really hasn't appeared in the press is chemistry. And I think the chemistry is actually better than I expected. And we can look forward. I mean, Putin twice said, we're not to the promised land. We're not, quoting Tolstoy, yet, but there's this that maybe we can find our way in the darkness. It's very poetic, but I like the imagery.
Well, this is between two of them, and I agree with you. But what about Washington, what we call establishment? Will they let Biden?
Well, that's my biggest concern is, and I think Paul Craig Roberts put it this way, so I have to give him his due. Why should the Washington blob allow Biden to do what they didn't allow Trump to do, which was improve relations? What's in it for them? Aside from survival, but I don't think they're really thinking that that's a realistic danger for them.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you're right. But at least in some kind of nano, using high-tech technology in nano terms, maybe we will few nanos up from the bottom, not even millimeters, but at least we have some kind of, as you say, chemistry between two, which is important. And good thing is that media will not be as harsh at Biden as they were with Trump. So media will have to, be a little bit more calmer. And so, but the Washington establishment, or what Raymond Montgomery called Missy Met, they will continue their game. Well, it's too bad because it's a very powerful body. You call it blob, Washington blob, Missy Met, but it's very powerful, we have to admit. And then maybe at the end, when we review, then we will see what we as a civil society, anything that we can do to change their minds. I kind of doubt, but at least we can try. Who wants to go next?
Well, the media has not really kind about Biden and the summit. I watched the summit on BBC and listened to their commentary after the summit and after the press conferences. BBC of Putin or of Russia's. I mean, they've been very, but I was impressed that they pretty much played it straight down the middle. They were batting the comments that they made. While I was listening to them on BBC, I switched over to the three cable news networks. I was really appalled by what I heard there. They weren't really reporting on what happened or direct comments about it. They were using it as an opportunity to make a very biased point about Putin and Russia and about Biden's initiative to get involved in the summit in the first place.
Yeah, I was watching some MSNBC yesterday to see how they were going to cover it. And you know what they had on? They had Michael McFaul, John Bolton, Leon Panetta, Madeleine Albright, Hillary Clinton, Michelle Flournoy.
Yeah, and they topped it off with Gary Kasparov.
I didn't see him. the media coverage, and today I just caught a little bit of it, and you seem to have a few different angles. One is the people who said that Biden should never have done it. He should never have had this and given Putin, treating him as an equal on the international stage. And a lot of those were people like Ben Sass and Republicans, the same people who could have watched Trump perform fellatio on Putin on national television and applauded him and said what great technique he has. Those same people said this should not, the Republicans said they should not have done this. Then you had these today, you had the mainstream approach. And these were the people who said Biden was great. He was strong. He stood up to Putin. He told him where the red lines are. He threatened him. He said that if they interfere with America, this kind of cyber attacks, that we're going to take out their oil pipelines. And so then the second line is that how well Biden did and standing up to Trump and representing American values. Then you had a few who were more reasonable, who talked about the fact that expectations were low from the beginning and it was positive, and they spoke respectfully of each other, and they had some minor achievements, and on balance, this was a positive step that they're talking rather than insulting and threatening each other. So, but American media, I mean, the perspective that most of us are going to share was really absent, is absent almost entirely from, or entirely from mainstream media in the United States. And then I did about 6 interviews yesterday and a couple more today with Russian TV and Russian press. And they're looking, their approach and their treatment of this is so vastly different from the American treatment that, so I think we've made some headway yesterday in terms of tamping down the tensions and beginning to speak, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, well, but you confirm what I said, that at least some media, no, not all media, but some media will be nicer to Biden. Maybe they will let him do something, but still, when you compare media and the establishment, of course, media loses. I don't know how to deal with this powerful mismatch,
Exactly.
and still we cannot give up. But at least maybe we can, at the end of this discussion, see anything that we can do. I think group which we here we can call ourselves dissidents. So and sometimes dissidents get their way. Like in Soviet Union, Andrei Sakharov, if you follow his example, sometimes dissidents get their way. I don't know about the United States if dissidents can succeed here, but okay, who is next?
I'd like to follow up on some of the things I was saying. The U.S. media was typically disparaging of Vladimir Putin and Putin's performance. The new popular term is whataboutism, and they mocked his answers on certain things, which I also was very critical of in my interviews. But I think he leaves himself very vulnerable by some of the responses that he gives when he talks about, in response to the criticisms of his treatment of Navalny, by talking about bringing up the insurrection on January 6th. Or when also he does that in response to questions. One of the questions was that why does he keep killing his political opponents? And he talks about violence in America and the fascist mob that attacked the Capitol of the United States on January 6th, and talks about them as peaceful protesters, somehow equivalent to the anti-corruption backers of Navalny. I think he does himself no credit at all when he denies that cyber attacks are coming from Russia and says that the main sources of cyber attacks are the United States, Canada, Latin America, and Britain. I think he undermines his own credibility and gives these people lots of fodder for their attacks on him. On the other hand, you hear no criticism of Biden and some of the absurd things that Biden says, a couple of which I pointed out in my interviews. When Biden talks about, says that the United States is unique because it was founded on a concept, and that concept was freedom and human rights. And nobody bothers to ask the 4 million plus slaves who were brought here from Africa and then born in the United States, or the millions of Native Americans who were slaughtered in this quest for freedom and human rights. And Biden gets away with that. Or what I thought was Biden's biggest whopper, he says, how would it be if the United States were by the rest of the world as interfering with the elections of other countries? And everybody knew it. I mean, the obvious
Exactly.
thing is the United States does interfere in everybody's elections, has been doing so since the CIA was set up in 1947, and the world does know it. A recent poll of the Alliance of Democracies asked people in 53 countries, more than 50,000 people, who poses the biggest threat to democracy. 44% said the United States, 38% China, 27% said Russia. So the world does know this. I don't know where, what rock Biden has finally crawled out from under, know about the history of this country in terms of slavery and side, or the role the United States has played around the world. But you don't see any criticism of that or discussion of that in the American media. So, overall, I thought that yesterday was very encouraging. They had gone out of their way to lower expectations, diminish expectations. So, and the fact that they spoke so respectfully of each other, that they both said it was positive and constructive, that they did return the ambassadors, that they did set up this strategic dialogue, that they are going to deal with questions of cyber and nuclear, that they issued a joint statement reaffirming the statement from 1985 that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, that they're going to begin the negotiations on that for an expansion of the START treaty, some of the other issues that are so essential. They talked climate change. They talked about the pandemic. They talked about the regional conflicts that they did speak. I thought it was more encouraging that they spoke about the Minsk II as the basis for thinking about Ukraine after the Kiev government has said that it was dead on arrival. I thought those were positive takeaways, and that in some ways we've eased the tensions. When we get back to the question of why the American establishment might be more open now toward dealing positively with Russia, it's partly because they're obsessed with China, and
Yes,
that they don't know what a threat this kind of alliance between Russia and China poses. Even the G7 meetings, back in the 70s, the G7 represented 80% of global GDP. By 2000, that was down to 65%. Now it's somewhere between 30 and 40%. And everybody, they recognize that the threat comes from China. And they also talk about the Arctic. And one of the things that's positive from the Russian perspective is this thawing of the Arctic, which is going to bring not only the seas, but much agriculture, other development. So in some ways, global warming actually is in Russia's interest in a perverse sense,
Exactly.
making a lot of area much more accessible. So I thought that on balance, this was a very positive step in the right direction. Putin is not going to be suckered into a divide and conquer strategy, triangulation, the way China was with Nixon. And I think that there are a lot of problems still to be dealt with, but we're at least on the road to something that can ease tensions and begin to deal with each other in a more positive way.
Okay, Peter, thanks. Let's go to Europe now. We have Glenn Diesen in Oslo, Norway. Glenn, what's the view from Europe?
Well, from my perspective, at least, it was the media very critical here as well. But from my perspective, it was it was a success, a small success, but nonetheless a success. So we spoke a bit before this summit, and I was quite skeptical simply because there are so many areas which are beyond negotiation where neither side will move. However, part of the problem over the past, especially 7 years, has been that because of these areas where there's room for negotiation and there's so much infighting, you've had this tit-for-tat escalation of conflicts, which has begun to tear away at the areas where there actually are common interests. And so my takeaway from this summit was that it had some very positive components, which was the mutual interest in restoring cooperation in areas of mutual interest. So again, it's limited, but still it's arms control. You have cybersecurity, returning ambassadors back to their posts. So there are several areas where both have a mutual interest in cooperation. The fact that they were able to segment that away from the areas where there's disputes as a positive development, because as several now have pointed out, there's a tendency to use areas of conflicts as a reason not to work in other areas. For example, the former ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, he wrote an article that success is conflict. Success is confrontation, with the effectively that everything that if they have any nice words exchange and if positive, this will be good for Putin, and whatever is good for Russia is bad for America. So again, this is very much thought. Now, but again, they achieved what they could achieve because the disagreements between the United States and Russia, they have not really changed. But the positive thing is this effort not to make these disagreements prevent the areas which are important both for mutual cooperation and also for the cooperation of the world. I think it's a great achievement, and I think it was quite clever to tie this clearly to Ukraine, because this is how we ended here, and I think that's also the reason why we're getting out of it, because for the past 7 years, since 2014, the US has used this maximum pressure strategy against Russia, and this is what has also resulted in dismantling areas of mutual interest. So, for example, Washington hoped that if it can cause more pain to Moscow than it will cause to Washington, it would be worth it to some extent in terms of negotiating from a position of strength. As it was pointed out, neither the US or Britain, for that matter, has been very comfortable with the Minsk agreement, which the Ukrainians, to a large extent, have rejected. And so for the past 7 years, there seems to have been an effort to weaken Russia while propping up Ukraine in order to renegotiate this Minsk agreement. However, what they now found was at the end, this was not the case. Instead, this was leading to a war, which would have been very unpredictable, but most likely Russia ending up on top. The more this maximum pressure has pushed Russia into the arms of China, and overall, Russia is not moving on this. So it's an issue of existential threat. So I don't think I think it's recognized that this policy has come to its end, and also dismantling these areas of mutual beneficial cooperation is not sustainable anymore. And for me, that kind of explains some of the issues they focused on as well, because they decided not to focus so much on China, red lines, Nord Stream 2, NATO, Iran, and areas which would have cast too much of a big shadow over the small positive things they could achieve. But again, that was my interpretation. I thought they were able to salvage what they could, which was the mutual beneficial areas, while playing down the areas of contention. But I still remain that the areas of contention is still very, very problematic, and that's why, speaking of Navalny, for example, creates a lot of conflict. But it was also the reason why Putin felt he had to push back by pointing out American human rights abuses, because as we discussed last time, this is not negotiable simply because, well, as Biden said, this is who we are. We have to promote this. It will always be on the table. But from Russia's perspective, it's not acceptable to the extent it becomes a hegemonic norm. So to the extent it's a tool of sovereign inequality, which goes against the Helsinki Treaty, which is that, again, it can be used as an instrument for the US to interfere in Russia, topple government, engage in wars, and overall exempt itself from international law. So from that extent, I think what Putin was trying to communicate is, if you're going to talk about human rights, it will go both ways. Otherwise, we have to scrap it off the international security discourse. And I think that neither side are willing to move an inch. So I think the best approach is what they did. They played this down and instead focused on the few areas where we can actually cooperate. And again, I think that's as good as it gets.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. Let's go back to Washington. Herb, Reginbogin from Catholic University. Herb, what do you say?
I take this as more of a reset of this relationship in terms of not the typical one-on-one situation, but rather 5 groups, 5 representatives that were a part of this meeting on Wednesday, on Thursday. One of the most important parts of the combination of the G7, the NATO, and the meeting between Putin and Biden is the constellation of how the alliance will interact with Russian spheres of interest and American interest. And that is pivoted in Afghanistan. Turkey will now take over the international security responsibilities to protect the airport. It will further, through its Islamic context and chains of communication, have a greater interaction with Islamic actors, state, non-state. The communication also be tenuable because the Taliban will not perceive that they're dealing with the Western world, but rather one of their own in the neighborhood. It's very important to see that the interests between Russia and the United States is to control a unexpected conflict, not only originating between US and Russia, but through other countries such as Iran, such as with China, such as with non-state actors which have terrorist objectives focused not only against the United States, but also Russia. And this is the history of Afghanistan. Russian occupation, withdrawal, American presence, and their withdrawal. The cycle of these issues need to be better regimented through a security concept that the United States and Russia are pursuing within the scope of these 5 working groups. And these working groups articulate actually a much vertical orientation of predictability. It's also environment, it's also about energy security, but it's probably much more important as a reset that each of their leaders and respectively their civil societies and those leaders along in economic, cultural, financial, and in security. The whole baseline has really been broadened through this meeting because it invites an enormous amount of other participants. And the media yes, is critical or it's one-sided, but that's not really important. Important is that the media doesn't know what happened yesterday. And that's the essence of what is actually to be the speculation on our part, to evaluate who were those people in that room? What do they represent? When I have a third person in the State Department, Mrs. Newland, representing the security interests, and she is primarily an expert on Europe and on Ukraine, then I would have to begin to understand more and more, why is she there? Why was this the choice? Why was the ambassador, the Russian ambassador there? All of these have different chains of interests. And here in the United States, we have very important geostrategic leaders in California, articulated through Brown, former governor. We have it articulated in areas where the Russian community and the American communities have a greater presence. It's basically taking apart the current situation before this meeting and elevating it into different cultural dynamics, where security and economy playing a much bigger role because of climate change. And Russia and the United States have a very important priority in developing these dynamics. I think this is what has to be taken from this meeting between Biden and Putin, is that this is a watershed. Although it's not yet predictable, because there's no facts, but I would assume, based on my reading of the different historical lessons of Russia and the United States, they will beginning to demonstrate, first of all, certain accentuations of acceptance, maybe through an exchange of prisoners. They may also simply articulate it through different types of policies, such as working closer, not only in Afghanistan, but in Syria, certainly the interest of Libya, and all of these geostrategic areas. Paramount above all, Iran, and with the new Israeli government, will play an important catalyst in the United States to jointly find ways that will benefit their spheres of interest and their security. That is my take on that meeting yesterday.
Thank you, Herbert. Martin, Sieff, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm with consensus here, Ed, and it's a very welcome consensus. When we gathered equal to the summit, all of us shared cautious pessimism, and we hoped for the best. And our hope turned out to be true, and our considered pessimism, to at least a limited degree, was confounded. And this is a very welcome development. I think that the new beginnings here, I agree with Peter, Glenn, very, very strongly. The new beginnings here are very positive. They're still fragile, but I think there's room for more potential here rather than less. And I'd recommend everyone to look at Sputnik news agency this morning carried a report which is then reprinted on Johnson's Russia list. President Putin today spoke about the summit when he was speaking to a Russian Center for Higher Education. And the emphasis, we all know President Putin is not undiplomatic, but he is very frank. He is highly intelligent and observant. He's dealt with many American presidents now over the past 20 years. And he had high praise for Joe Biden. And he said something very interesting. He said the image of Biden in the American press is totally false, but the Russian press has got Biden wrong as well. This is hugely important. He said President Biden is very professional. And I don't want to paraphrase the other remarks. I don't want to read from them online. You can read them for yourselves. But there is a level of respect here, which was certainly lacking in his assessments of Obama. And privately, I am convinced of George W. Bush. And there is a further point. In the election campaign of 2020, when it comes to Wall Street, alas, I'm never particularly prescient. I avoid the worst mistakes, but I really don't get in on. But when it comes to politics, I do have a track record in American politics of betting on low-rated candidates and seeing them rise. I seldom get credit or benefit professionally from it afterwards, because the worst thing you can do in Washington is, as you know, Ed, all too well, is to be right too soon and too long. They'll never forgive you for that. And I've been a beneficiary if that's the same process. But I backed Donald Trump to become president of the United States from as soon as he walked down that escalator in 2015 with Trump Towers. And I also took Joe Biden very seriously through the campaign of 2020. Sorry, can you hear me? My own screen has gone, the screen is up. The screen, Herb is back, so that the screen is clearly working again. But here's the point. This is not a man to he's old. He has to pace himself. But this is a man who throughout his career has always been underestimated and despised, both left and right. And he has won enormous Trump, Barack Obama. They were all outsiders and neophytes and innocents in Washington. They did not know how Washington politics and bureaucracy worked. Joe Biden has lived his entire life at an eminent level in the Washington political field. The conventional wisdom is this compromises him, it makes him contemptible, it makes him a joke. I've met the president a number of times. I know people who have been longtime members of the staff. The consensus is always the same. This is not Superman, but this is a highly intelligent, moral, decent man who treats his own personal staff with respect, honorably, and well. And also understands the constraints of what very little you can do. And he certainly has gone along with all the prevailing wisdoms and going into Iraq in 2003, and the rest. The record on that is clear. So he won't go very far. Peter is completely right on this. But there's a very crucial point. President Trump wanted to go further, got nowhere at all, because he alarmed the deep state, the media loathed him. So he was virtually totally neutralized, even though his instincts on many issues, not all, were admirable. Joe Biden is a much more cautious fellow than his predecessor. But within those limits, he can do more, and we have just seen it. A couple of classic examples we have both touched on here. Three really bureaucratic processes were set up or revived yesterday at the summit. We have the Cyber Security Initiative. We have the strategic dialogue, and we have something that nobody has put alongside them, though it belongs alongside them, the return of the ambassadors. What do these three different developments have in common? They are all setting up or reviving or strengthening bureaucratic processes. And this is hugely important because in the Washington system, in most government systems, but especially in Beltway Washington, bureaucratic systems develop momentum of their own for both good and ill. This was something the neocons, alas, understood for decades extremely well and were able to get with a great degree. They were able to institutionalize their simplistic fanaticism and lies by setting up bureaucratic systems that different people would come in, would happily condition themselves to serve the particular processes or systems or think tanks or institutions. And the process was a self-renewing one. We now have Joe Biden opening up a new set of processes which are positive. Now, this is not to underplay the hostile forces here, but one other factor, again, confounded our expectations. There was a widespread sense that because Hunter Biden had very dubious business connections in Ukraine, the president would be in his son's pocket and therefore would be in the pocket of the extremely unstable and irresponsible successive governments of Ukraine and interests there. And this was what really motivated President Trump and his people to probe into this, because although much of it was political hardball and meanness, there was also an element of concern that the safeguard and national security of the United States should not be held hostage to all these competing gangsters and corrupt businessmen and extremist Russia haters in Ukraine. But what are we now finding? We are now finding that the president and his longtime right-hand man, Antony Blinken, are, if not, are throwing Ukraine, at least to some degree, under the bus, which in terms of national security and interest of the United States is exactly the right thing to do. How far will this go? We don't know yet. It may not go very far, because one can't be too optimistic here, because the forces of extremism and militarism and sheer ignorance and irresponsibility are far too great. But the other advantage Joe Biden has is, not being Donald Biden, the media find themselves hung under their own petard, and so does the deep state. They spent 4 years working systematically to discredit Donald Trump, who certainly was often his own worst enemy. But we also saw that most of the accusations were so absurd and amateurish against Trump that they got no traction. They backfired. They discredited both the media and the institutions of the deep state in the minds of at least half of the American people, which is very profound, very, very profound. By contrast, they built up Joe Biden as a safe hand because they were desperate for any credible candidate to replace Trump. And there was no one else credible, which was a huge comment on the bankruptcy of the Democratic Party. But having propelled Biden into the White House, they're stuck with him. They are stuck with him. So I think we should all wish long, good health and prosperity for President Biden. Peter understands it perfectly. He's far from ideal. He won't go far. All his limitations are real, but those limitations are also his strengths relative to other people we'd have to deal with. And what he has just proven at the summit is he can do much more than Donald Trump ever did, or than Barack Obama ever did, and he has already done so. Even as a liberal, he's pushed through much more sweeping infrastructure reforms and fundings than Barack Obama ever dreamed or dared to do. Obama completely squandered. I blame him, a lot of the former president Rahm Emanuel for this. They had total dominance of the Senate and the House in 2009. They had the whole public support for them. There was a revulsion, understandably and rightly, against that idiot Bush too. And they threw it all away because Rahm Emanuel said, you've got to guard your political strength to use later. And of course, that just meant losing it completely. 78-year-old Joe Biden did not make that mistake. He has been bold, he is decisive, and he has just made clear again that if the Republicans in the House and the Senate won't push through everything he wants on infrastructure and internal reform, he's going to at least try to boldly push it through without them. Obama would never have dared to do that. And in the same way here, by being quiet and operating under the radar, the way a skillful United States senator gets things done, even in limited ways, I think we have our first serious Senate president, arguably in all of history, certainly in modern, no, since Truman. And Truman certainly knew the Senate of his day. And I'm not an admirer of Truman's horrific policy. And the point is, he got those horrific policies through and done to a large degree because he knew how Congress worked. He'd been in it for so many years, for more than a decade in the Senate. Joe Biden was in the Senate for what, 30 years? So this is hugely positive. So we can't ignore the forces of darkness. I note that Victoria Nuland flew straight to Brussels. I doubt it was simply to brief our NATO allies. It was more likely to commiserate with her fellow superhawks, especially from Poland and the Baltic states, to see what they could come up with next. I think they were taken by surprise. I don't think they anticipated any of this, because that's one of the weaknesses of these people. They are very narrow and linear and rigid. They push endlessly. Like Hitler, they are obsessed with the triumph of the will. But like Hitler, they can't adapt to changing circumstances. So let's hope those analogies continue. So I finished there, but I saw much more positive things from the summit than I ever dreamed of expected. And while so much depends simply on the continued health and capability of one man, he has right now, at age 78, a lot more capability and ability to do good, and a much more positive and impressive track record than any of us ever dared to hope for.
Okay. Thank you, Martin.
Can I follow up with a quick question?
Sure.
Martin, I'm willing to be convinced, but at the core of whether I can be convinced about the opportunities that a Biden administration has to offer is the answer to this question. Do you think there's more there than we've seen? Do you think that there is actually a longer term international relations agenda for the Biden administration? Because the only one articulated so far has been the highly ideological and disruptive agenda of fighting authoritarianism and promoting human rights and democracy.
That's an excellent point, Nick. I fully agree with you. Fundamentally, of course, you are right. And Biden is fundamentally a man of his entire lifetime. And he made this clear in his comments on human rights and democracy. He has swallowed the Kool-Aid. And as I said, there are limits to what we can expect from him. But as Ed pointed out, and Glenn has pointed out, and our old friend Patrick Armstrong, I think, is very much in the forefront of insights on this. Realism is breaking in on these people when they don't want it to. They really have been, the bipolar world is really 20 years old. The Russia-China alliance is 20 years old. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization celebrated 20th anniversary. 2 days ago, it's just turned 20, carrying out full scales of troops from Russia and China for more than 15 years. There is no secret about this on the Russian side. They are proud of it. Whenever you, I think you've seen it too, Nick, whenever one is in Russia or Ukraine or anywhere in the Russia language block of nations in the world, which still stretches over 11 time zones, the news piped from Moscow always prominently displays the joint exercises that the SCO carry out. Only Washington has been willfully blind to this. And I can tell you, 2- and 3-star and probably 4-star generals in our armed forces are blind to this. Most of them have never even heard of the SCO, incredibly enough. And yet now, at long last, the penny is beginning to drop that you can't take on Russia or China without taking on both of them. And they are terrified by this. And they are also, of course, paying the price for the ghastly misdirection that George W. Bush put them into, and Obama kept, and Trump too, kept them to endless wars on terrorism, which, apart from killing hundreds of thousands and millions of perfectly innocent people, also exhausted the US armed forces and allowed China and Russia to catch up with and now surpass the United States in strategic weaponry. Now, these people aren't Einsteins, they're slow on the mark. But the penny is finally beginning to drop. So that's the real answer to your question. No, he hasn't changed. No, we can't expect too much from this. But reality is impeding itself on these people. They would definitely want to go after China. They are so intellectually bereft that they think they can repeat Nixon and Kissinger with China. Exactly. It's ludicrous. What if they actually bothered looking? Nixon setting up the visit to Beijing in 1972. They had to convince the Chinese very slowly that they were reliable, and they had to keep the Russians reassured by maintaining responsible, restrained policies at the same time. These people, like Trump's clowns before them, are incapable of that. So no, you're right. Concern is totally correct. We can't go too far. But having said that, a combination of A, reality, B, Biden's much despised experience as a senator, never much, but working beneath the radar screen, and simply not having Trump's gift to outrage and terrify and polarize people. These are positives. You're right to be skeptical. I don't disagree with you for a second. It's the best we can hope for. I come from Northern Ireland. I'm used to coming from a world of low expectations or zero expectations. So
thanks. Listen, we have also maybe voice from Canada, Montreal. Matt, how does it look from Canada? Because we have Europeans now, Americans. What about Canadians? What do you think?
I don't know if I speak for all Canadians here, but to offer my humble 2 cents. I think that indeed, just like everyone else here, or I think most people here on the call, I was also happily surprised that it wasn't a disaster. I was happy that it happened. That was a concern I think a lot of us shared, that we know that there were previous to have meetings between Trump and Putin in the past that were sabotaged. Certain meetings that had happened when when Trump was meeting with Xi Jinping, which resulted in a certain conveniently timed disaster in Syria. So this actually happened, and it wasn't a train wreck. The fact that diplomatic channels are opening back up again, that is very important. The agreement to have certain red lines, certain rules to not destroy ourselves is certainly very good. No one can refute that. So I think, though, that it's also important to, as many of the speakers have already mentioned, to never treat anything in politics as a two-point interaction. There's always a multiply connected system at play, and this meeting is obviously an interconnected part of a process that began with the G7. It continued with the NATO summit, and this is one aspect of that, a unified doctrine. And I think that when looking at the idea of self-interest going into the future, you sort of have comparing the unipolar worldview, which we've seen run roughshod over the world for a number of years. When you compare that with the multipolar Greater Eurasian Partnership, which obviously has been targeted as a great rival, a threat to be undermined in any way possible by the great liberal democracies of the G7 and Europe and NATO. There's two different sets of self-interest that are competing. They're not the same thing. And certainly I was thinking a little bit about the tale of the Good Samaritan, and sure enough, it's a wonderful tale. Martin Luther King Jr. used that quite a bit to get across what is a durable peace, what is a durable form of justice versus one that has no endurance, no ability to persevere in the long term. And it's good that, these people who were these different, people on the pathway, they saw this person who had been beaten up, robbed, left for dead. It's good that they chose to not continue what the robbers began by killing the person who was there. So it's a negative good to, maybe somebody even could have passed by that bloodied person and maybe could have said, well, hey, there's something else that hasn't been stolen. Let me take that. That's good that they withheld that potential desire. But it's infinitely better to have an active form of peace, of going and actually helping somebody and changing the circumstances, despite the fact that there are prejudices, there's pain between various parties. Nick recently gave a really great lecture on this, on the Orestes trilogy and Aeschylus, which I really liked. And today, if you look at how every time that Russia and China, Putin, Xi Jinping, for years have been speaking about their Western partners, it's always been as partners. They almost always say are partners. And there have been olive branch after olive branch offered to the West to work with the Belt and Road Initiative,
Yes.
to work with the Greater Eurasian Partnership on mutual development of science, technology. Asteroid defense has been initiated as a discussion from Rogozin at Cosmos. So what we've seen, however, coming out of the G7 has been, we need to create an anti-BRI alternative, a clean green initiative, or the Build Better for the World initiative. How it's going to be funded, that's totally not clear. They're committing $100 billion for starters through a lot of private funding. The U.S. currently is sitting, I think people are looking at the U.S.'s status as a power sitting on the biggest basket case economy that once was very productive. They once could do things in the United States. They once had manufacturing, the ability to build infrastructure. Those were things that the U.S. once enjoyed. And it's been nation stripped now for 45 plus years of just outsourcing, of deregulation, of, we all know what happened. In general terms, we saw that this policy was attempted in China in the 1980s with Zhao Ziyang, George Soros's man on the ground in China, who co-founded a think tank with George Soros, who was the head of the CCP for a number of years, who finally the Chinese realized what they were letting in, what was this poison of liberalization. Milton Friedman was being studied in Beijing, and they finally woke up and kicked out Soros and all of Zhao Ziyang networks. I think he died in house arrest in 2005 or something. In the case of Russia, they didn't wake up so fast. It took them a little bit longer to feel some of the pain of Yeltsin's reforms, and finally they've been pushing back and rebuilding now for a number of years, and they're still suffering. They're still working to rebuild the damage that was done. But I think that instead of trying to create alternatives to the BRI or expand NATO to become a global force, an increased budget that involves now jurisdiction across the Pacific instead of just being the Atlantic, which is what came out of the recent NATO summit, I think that it would be much, much better, or reviving the TPP, which is another thing that's currently being discussed. I think it would be much better to seriously look at offers that Putin has made for Arctic development going back to 2007, where I don't think Bush Jr. understood what the hell was going on, but the offer was first made by Russia to really invest in serious cooperative infrastructure in the Arctic that would benefit both sides under a win-win paradigm. It was re-offered again in 2011. There's a lot of points of common interest that would be transformative and not just like a withholding of war, which is, again, good to withhold war, but it doesn't change anything. It doesn't create long-term stability that really has sustainability to it. So that's what I would say. That's what's lacking, and I think it's good that we got somewhere with diplomacy, discussion. Red lines is good, but we need more of a practical, transformative type of policy that's more long-term. It's more in harmony with the Belt and Road Initiative thinking. So yeah, that's what I would just throw out there.
I think Bill Dunkerley, I think he introduced me a couple of days ago to Pat Dowden from Geneva. Is she was us? Bill, maybe you speak for her. Bill.
Pat is based in Philadelphia.
Okay.
But she is the head of a Russian organization that deals with business ethics and has done a lot of spade work there.
Okay, because I thought she's from Geneva, because there was a letter from Geneva, right? I mean, maybe I got confused. Anyway, I think is anyone wants to add a few words? Because
I'd like to add something, Ed, and that I thought there was a gem buried in Biden's comments. Before the summit, for a long time, people have been talking about the cyber attacks as being something that Putin is to blame for. They said that something like that couldn't go on in Russia if Putin hadn't approved it. Biden, in his remarks in the press conference, he referred to it as being staged by criminals on Russian soil,
yes,
which I thought was a really big difference and a very more practical way of dealing with it. In fact, there's an article on your website that recommended that approach to Biden. So I was glad. I don't think that reading your website is at the top of the agenda, but he got the idea from somewhere. And one other thing, and that is about the way Putin handled the human rights and political issues at the at his press conference, which I thought was a masterful press conference.
Yes,
He dug right in, took questions right away, whereas Biden started his with a speech about America's manifest destiny to bring the rest of the world in line with its own thinking. But when Putin was called on the carpet about the alleged political interventions and so on, I thought his answer was frankly childish, where he says, well, you do it too. And that was I think the only goof he really made in that press conference, but not defending himself against specious allegations is something that Putin has a long history with. His international reputation has been soiled based on fabrications and distortions. And he's never defended himself properly. I blame some of it on Peskov, Dmitry Peskov, who makes a reasonable spokesperson for him. But I've seen that Putin relies on him for strategic advice about his image. And I think Peskov is way out of his depth in dealing with that kind of stuff.
I agree. Good point.
Okay.
May I make a comment, Ed?
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Valeria?
Okay. Yes, I do think that Putin defends himself, but maybe not in some of these more narrow contexts, such as the summit in the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. He has engaged in interviews and discussions in which he has elaborated at great length, Russia's position concerning Ukraine, Afghanistan, and so on. So I think perhaps it's more of a mixed picture as far as how well or how consistently Putin has defended his positions in the context of accusations that were unfair or unfounded.
Okay. Well, I think at the beginning, what I mentioned is that we're at second session. First was from St. Petersburg, when we had some expectations what's going to happen at the summit. And now we discussed actually what happened. Now, the next thing is, I think it was proposed by Valerie, which you're speaking from what city?
I'm speaking from Lubbock, Texas,
Okay.
where now everyone is going to be able to carry a gun, whether openly or so.
Okay.
A little bit alarmed, but I'm in Northwest Texas.
We had quite a geography today. You see, we just cover the world, right? We had Oslo and Montreal and Washington, of course, and now we had Texas. Anyone else? Did I miss someone? Any other? San Francisco, of course.
Pat Dowden has posted a comment that she's here, but in just a listening mode.
Okay. So next thing, which I think it was Matt and Valerie, that maybe besides analyzing, maybe we should do something. And I think Matt already started this thing by promoting some of the projects. But all of us, most of us are professors at different universities. So we have access to young people, young students. And what I suggest is that maybe we will involve young people and not only analyze mistakes done by our politicians, but also will offer them some kind of way forward. And now it's summertime. So university, it's 2 months away. Maybe we can use this time to prepare, but I invite all of you to think about this. And maybe doesn't have to be like weekly or bi-weekly, maybe once a month. We will have something like that and involve young people and maybe try to tell them what they can do to maybe improve and correct mistakes done by us, but by our parents, and no, look forward with some hope. So this is my invitation. And finally, as you know, I'm running a Washington Times column. It's a monthly column. And of course, next column is due on June 23. So we have a few days. If some of you wants to add a paragraph or two with maybe the summary of your presentation, now, of course, it should be short, 1-2 paragraphs. I will quote you, of course, I'll put your name, but this will be our, kind of opinion about what happened at the summit, maybe some ideas what's next. And Washington Times, of course, it's no, maybe it doesn't have such a large audience as Washington Post and New York Times, but still it's read. It is read by people we criticize today. I mean, Republicans, I have to admit. No, I am one of them. But sometimes you have to be. I already, by the way, publicly apologized to American people for voting for George W. Bush, because when he was running for office, I had on my Russia House window on DuPont Circle, I had this big banner called "Russians for Bush." Boy, was I mistaken! But I apologize. I apologize to American people. So, well, sometimes I wish George Bush would apologize too. What he did. Okay. Anyone else wants to finish, and we will stay in touch. Thank you for taking time. Again, send me a couple of paragraphs. You will be prominently featured in Washington Times. By the way, in case someone doesn't know, Martin was senior foreign policy editor for many, many years. How many years you worked at Washington Times?
13 years.
13.
Oh, but that's the dim distant past. We're in a different, we are different people now.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, it's a great session. We covered again. We covered the globe, and well, maybe we contributed something.
I think so.